This morning, maybe a minute or so past, apologize for that. At this time, though, we are going to begin our study with prayer. If you would, bow your heads. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the time we share in spiritual things. We thank you for your word. We pray this morning that your word will have its intended purpose on our hearts to grow our faith, to redirect our steps into mature understanding of this world and the next. We also ask as disciples that you give us the appropriate time to mature, give us the length of experience to be a good example, and the opportunities to use that knowledge and insight in this world. Please forgive us of our sins, and we offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so we are hopefully, if the Lord wills and my brain stays intact and fully functioning over the next 40 minutes or so, going to be finishing out our survey of the kings, paying attention to that chart that's in the middle-ish section of your workbook if you're using one of the workbooks. The print form, that is. We've got a few of the kings to continue before we close out the history of Israel, and then we'll be paying, obviously, sole attention to Judah. As there is a series of events that cascade through this time period that bring all the bulk of Israel into captivity. All that gets left in the Palestinian/Israelite space are what would have been considered by their conquerors the most vulnerable, the weakest, and the least desirable. These are the ones who would not have been in great health. They would have not had great wealth, and they certainly would have been able to raise the sword as a warrior. And so that's what gets left there. That is also the groups that would then be the population that's Israelite upon the return aspect. We want to lay a little bit more groundwork for that shift that's going to be taking place soon in our study, and also soon in the sense of our kind of viewpoint and looking at the circumstances of Israel. If you remember, when we've studied the various prophetic works and the latter prophets, sometimes referred to as the minor prophets, or the 12 is a Hebrew Bible term to refer to those same groupings of individuals. There is a series of complications that prevent the returnees from fully reoccupying in the way that they wanted to Jerusalem and the surrounding area. The kings we're looking at right now are the ones who are in power that allows that circumstance to be created. What they're doing as they fail to keep idolatry out, as they fail to maintain the covenantal relationship with the land, whether they be Israelite kings or Judite kings, because they're seeding that land with apostasy. When the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the other conquering nations would come into the lands in this era and this time frame, which Rome copied, by the way, later down the road, is that they would move entire populations. They would disorder them, moving away from their family and their power-based structures. Here's the way to think about this in terms of the biblical record. If you remember, when Israel exited from Egypt, and they made their way through and then down what we consider the Sinai Peninsula and back up again in their circumstances to enter into the Promised Land, the nations on that outer edge, the rim nations that would be present in our map, kind of thinking the reigns of Moab, Edom, and Ammon, those nations made, and the tribes that were there, made requests to parley. Those requests to parley would lead eventually to this request. You need to marry into our group. You need to take wives from us. We'll take wives from you. We will become one people. There's a lot of reasons why that's an important strategic move for even a nomadic people, like many of these tribes were, many of these people were. It gives them a family bond and says, we're going to protect you, you'll protect us, and in a generation or two, we'll basically be the same people. We'll have blended together. Well, when Assyria, Babylon, and Rome rise into their various levels of power, that's the world they live in. And so the way to solve that problem of highly interconnected, family-united places is to simply take an entire population and march them somewhere else. Now, here's a thought for you. Is that the only time in history that that kind of thing occurs? No. It's absolutely not. If you're familiar with North Georgia, Dahlonega in particular, what is a historical component to the history of Dahlonega that would be relevant to our story? What circumstance kind of starts there in that North Georgia region?
Trail of Tears.
Trail of Tears originates in that area where we took an entire population, we as an American people at that point. We can't blame, like I sometimes do, everything that happens before the Revolution on the British. That's perfectly fine to blame them because they were in charge. Now we have to accept accountability and ownership, and we moved an entire people further and further west to an area where it's not their area, into other people's areas, in part to diminish their power. We also just wanted their stuff. As a nation, nations do that. We want your stuff, we're going to come take your stuff. That's one of the reasons that expansion happens when nations are next to each other. So we're seeing here the seeding of that. What is uncommon is for people to return to their ancestral land. That's actually a relatively uncommon thing in a historic way. And really in modern history, there's only a couple of peoples who have done that and gone back to the land that was theirs and successfully done so. So they return, they take it, they own it, they establish themselves, and they take root. So what we're kind of capturing here is, okay, this is a larger part of the Bible story that is being fed to us right now in small doses. Hey, this is happening. Hey, all these people are going to leave. Hey, these kings are the failure points. But remember, there's one other edge on the other end. So I've looked forward a little bit. I've gone forward to what will happen with the various stages of return. Let's go back and think a little bit further to Israel post-conquest, but before the appointment of Saul as the first king of Israel. What was the generalized request of the people of Israel at that point? What did they want? They wanted a king, and what was their description or caveat? What's the statement?
Like everyone around us.
Yeah, the phrase that we attach it to in our heads is, we're going to have a king like everybody else. Very often, what one person says they want and they describe one way is seen entirely different by the other end of the equation. So we want a king like everybody else so that we don't have to worry about it, so that they can go to war, so they can handle all this. We're tired of fooling with it. King comes in from Saul, including David, Solomon, and beyond, because they're not that much different in this level. They tax, they raise armies, they levy, and they send those bodies out to war. That's what kings do. So yes, they got a king like all the nations around them. And yes, that king did exactly what you would expect a king to do. And yes, it created the context for this constant turmoil of interrelational experiences between all the nations around them, with the status place of a king upon the return. Because you notice when they return, they're constantly having to negotiate with everybody around them. Everyone's got to check with this king, that king, and the other kings. And the conflict shifts off of the moral plane. We have a right to be here because God gave us the land, to we have a right to be here because the king said we could. The king that governs us. So inasmuch as they return from captivity forward, they never truly have independence. And so that's an important capture point to recognize, is that from the close of the written record that we'll be seeing in some ways soonish, even up until the arrival of the Christ, Israel continues and was, and this is antiquity Israel, not modern Israel, a subject or vassal state. All that changed was who was in charge. And that's all that's changing here, is that which king is in charge. This is a thought point to add into your brain. When they asked for a king and God gave them a kingly line, that kingly line produced eventually the thread that brings Jesus, but they never stopped having a king. Even as captives, and you see this in their behavior, they had a king. Daniel in Babylon does good to the kingdom that he serves in while maintaining his faith, but he still has a king. And when they return, they still have a king. And even Paul recognizes this when he is presenting his experiences, talking about before and after Christ. He still respects the authority of the kings of the land. And so there's some great interplay to catch in that. All of that then sets us up to think about these closing aspects of Israel. Remember, we're still using Israel and Judah, or northern kingdom and southern kingdom, to define these two groups. After Israel goes into captivity, the term Judah becomes the primary term to describe these people. It should not take very much linguistic steps to figure out what the term Judah eventually becomes. What's the most common phrase that we use to describe these people? Starts with a J as well in our English language. Yeah, it's Jews. Now remember, that's the Angloed version of it. Their native language did not work with J's in the same way. There's no true J sound in Hebrew, and so it's kind of, we're taking Latin and Greek and kind of sticking them in there to make them sound a certain way for us. Most of the J sounds in Hebrew sound more like a mix between a I, a Y, and an H. So it's kind of squeezed together. That's why certain ways words sound the way that they do. Jerusalem would be Jerusalem, or Jerusalem in place of those terms. But anyway, what we're seeing here is the stages for that, where Israel is slowly being kind of chewed up. Menahem became king, and in his 10 years of his time frame in rulership of Israel, very cruel. He's going to fight against Tithash and Tirzah because they opposed not to him, or opened not to him, that is, they didn't open their doors and their, in this case, their physical selves, ripped open the pregnant women, took their children from them, and is certainly going to be some of the worst in the ways we categorize our kings. Invaded by Pul, who is the king of Assyria at that time, and forced to pay a substantial, almost enormous tribute. This is during the work of Hosea, the prophet. So you can kind of keep that in your mind that way. Pul of Assyria becomes, as we noted last week, eventually identified as Tiglath-Pileser. Becomes a title name, much like Caesar becomes a title for Rome. This is different than Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the word that is equivalent to king. This is a title at this point. Pekaniah comes, again for Israel here. Also a wicked king. That's the usual easy answer for all our Israelite kings. Son of Menahem, he is slain by Pekah, his captain. Once again, he is murdered by his own people. This is the time frame we mentioned before. Hosea, this is, my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Pekah begins a new dynasty for Israel, the captain rising up to the ranks. He is, surprisingly not, very wicked. Golden calves come in, rebels against Assyria. He solves it with an alliance with the president of Syria, a mutual protection pact, if you will. They try to force Judah to join their alliance. Jerusalem was attacked by Pekah and Rezin. Did not take the city, but many were killed and captives were then taken from Judah. He too was murdered by his own people. Hosea and Oded are serving as prophets in this time frame, and Tiglath-Pileser invades Syria, Israel, Phoenicia, and Philistia. And so now you have the expansion of the monolithic Assyrian Empire taking place. And so this Syrio-Assyrian space starts to grow. That will eventually be Babylonian in its longer context. This brings to us the picture of the other end of the tale, Jotham, who was king in Judah for 16 years. Mostly what was right in the sight of God. The people were corrupt at that point. They are then subjugated to the Ammonites, who are located predominantly on the other side of the river, kind of the effect that dividing our maps usually. Prophets of that time are Isaiah and Micah. When Isaiah comes on the scene, if you're thinking in terms of like the literary space of things, that means your time is short. Isaiah is the predictor of the fall for all these things taking place. You know it's super short when you hear the name Jeremiah, our weeping prophet who weeps and laments for the captivity of God's holy city. Ahaz follows. 16 years for him as well. Ahaz is a terribly wicked king. Worshipped, the southern pronunciation is either Baal or Baal, for this false god. This is also the individual who was willing to burn his children in the fire to the god Molech. Judah is invaded at this time by Edom and the Philistines. He sent to the king of Assyria for help. Tiglath-Pileser came against Damascus and took the city and killed Rezin and began, Ahaz in this case, submitting himself further to the gods of Syria. Again, you now have Isaiah and Micah prophesying in the southern space here. Switches over back to our northern kingdom with Israel and Hoshea. He's a wicked king, and we could qualify him as not as bad as, but that's like when the dad hears from his son, and the son goes, "Hey, Dad, my leg hurts." "Well, where does it hurt?" "Well, below my calf, like down here." "Well, you can just cut it off, and it'll feel better, right?" And that's a standard dad joke that every dad tells their kid to some degree or another, right? It doesn't solve the problem. Just because you eliminate this, it doesn't mean that what you've replaced it with is good. It doesn't make it better. And so, yes, we have a king who is better than the king before, but he's still wicked. He's still not accomplishing even the bare minimum of what we would use to qualify as being a good king. He is a tributary to Assyria. He makes an alliance with So, who at that time is the Pharaoh or king in Egypt. He rebels against Shalmaneser, king of Assyria. Samaria is then besieged by the Assyrians. Foreigners are then brought in from Babylon and other places, mixed with the poor, those less desirable that were left in the land. That then produces the people referred to as the Samaritans. So when we get to the time of Jesus, you go, where do these Samaritans come from? The answer is here, there, and everywhere. Some of the Samaritan origins are people who lived in the land then. But then there and everywhere else comes into play because they're now intermingled. They're going to lose some of their identity in that process. By the time of Jesus, a few hundred years later, you will be able to identify a Samaritan and a Judean, a Jew, as two separate people, but you'll also know that, hey, there's some similarities there. The similarities aren't even just in physical disposition. You can sometimes see yourself struggling with this when you see somebody and you go, all right, I can tell they're from the South because they like collard greens. I can figure that part out. Because collard greens are fairly strategically Southern. You're not going to get them in Washington, D.C., unless you go to a restaurant, or Washington, the state thereof, unless someone's from there, right? And you can figure that out. Well, they like collard greens. but I don't know which state they're from, because I'm not sure how they like their grits, because that's a different thing. And I'm not going to quiz you on how you like your grits, nor if you like grits, because I want to be able to walk home. So I want to keep my ability to walk. I don't want anyone to catch me in the ankle on the way home or the knee. It's perfectly fine, however you like your grits, or if you don't like them. I'm okay with that. If we're talking about tacos, then I might get my own club out. But that's how you do that. And if you want an even more easy one, you can kind of think about when sweet tea begins and when sweet tea ends. The people of America are fairly well defined and divided by that particular distinction. Well, that's in part what happens with this people group, because most of them genetically are not that diverse. The Mediterranean region all the way up to Babylonia, everyone kind of looks the same physically. But they dress differently and they think differently because their religions have varied. Well, Samaritans have a similarity to Israel, but they differ here. They still worship God, as they describe in the interactions with Jesus, but they don't worship God by going to Jerusalem. They worship God by going, and he casts this here, they're going to their idols. They're going to the mountains. They're going up to the hill country. This time frame, Hosea is their prophet. And again, you're still having them in conflict, as we noted, with So of Egypt, Shalmaneser IV of Assyria, besieges that Samaritan region, and the siege is finally finished by Sargon II. At this point in our thinking of things, this is the point where Israel is just done. So all the northern kingdom, which is about, in the sense of the population size, somewhere around 70% of the potential inhabitants of the area. 60 to 70% go into captivity at this point, showing the kind of closing stepping of this captivity space. You still have a half-tribe and change, with two other smaller tribes that are centered around Judah that are still trying. They're still engaged in keeping the covenant. And our first king of that group to consider is Hezekiah from Judah. Hezekiah is routinely and rightly recognized as being pretty much a good king. We think of him that way. We look at him that way. Does the things that good kings do. Takes down idols, trusts in the Lord, cleanses the temple, restores daily sacrifices, makes an effort to renew the spiritual life. They engage in a communal great Passover feast, taking in those from Asher, Manasseh, and Zebulun. This is the remnants of what's left come there. Isaiah and Micah are prophesying at that time. This is the kind of syncopated end of this two-part story where the drum still beats for Jehovah in Judah, but the hills have become silent. The northern part, which in some ways had the great resources, has now become silent. And now you have just a little bit left. And so at this point, we'll kind of lay this out. This is the sequence of our last steps of Kings. I didn't want to go that far, so I'll make it go back. That's as far as I wanted to go. This is kind of letting us see what's going to happen going next. It shows us not only where we tend to kind of consider our kings being in the terms of their spiritual disposition. This is also in terms of your workbook, this fitting in the lesson spaces, and so you're thinking about which numbers there. That should be the print book for those who are using the print book if you're trying to catch that. But this also shows us the inevitable end of Judah as well. There is some points of it's going to get better, it's going to be okay, but that's not exactly what happens. From Hezekiah, who we just looked at, we go to Manasseh. Manasseh is the king of Judah for 55 years. We've typically said that when there's a 40-year king, that's something to think about. 55-year king is an oddity in some ways, especially considering their moral disposition. We go from Hezekiah tearing everything down to Manasseh building everything up. He is also willing to engage in idolatry at a high level, engages in witchcraft or sorcery in the context of antiquity, probably easily noted as being worse than the Amorites, who were cast out before the Israelites captured the land. In the sense of his daily practice and what he engaged in, he's at least on par. Some of the times the prophets write of him as being worse. He is taken captive by the king of Assyria and then sent off into prison in Babylon. He does repent. He does do a petition to God and was allowed to come back to Jerusalem. And so there's not a full rejection of Jehovah pushing this nation away just yet. Isaiah is serving as the prophet. That leads to Amon. He's like Manasseh, except he doesn't repent. And much like the northern kingdoms, he's killed by his own people. Fairly consistent trend. But we do have a reprieve in Josiah. Josiah might be, and some would probably have some subjectively strong arguments, but he might be the best king that Judah had. Not Israel as a people when they were all together, but if we're thinking about just the southern kingdom, he might be. Judah's destruction has already been declared because of Manasseh's behavior. But Josiah purged the idols in the cities of Manasseh, Ephraim, Simeon, and Naphtali. He gave orders for the temple to be repaired. In there, they found a copy of the law of Moses. I want you to pause for a second and think about the timeline and figure out, okay, these are Israelites tasked to follow Jehovah, and now they're finding a copy. What have they been doing up to this point? There's individuals who are trying to serve God in this timeline. How successful can you be without the manual? We just don't know the full details of some of that. The prophets are still there and present. God is still working for them. So they're going to have direct access in some ways. But this law wasn't for explicitly just the king or the leaders, the priests. This law in the written form was for Israel. And so the real way to think about it is to think about how the people of Judah and the people of Israel behaved when the king or the priest wasn't around. That's what that law provides. And so their very first thing to do with it is to have it read publicly. Have it all be spelled out. It's also interesting at this time frame is the prophets Zephaniah, Nahum, Jeremiah, Habakkuk, and even the prophetess Huldah are all present and working in this time frame. That's a pretty interesting context because, again, the destruction of Jerusalem was inevitable, but it was postponed because of Josiah's reforms, and God was most certainly heavily active in what was going on. Josiah begins a campaign to further destroy idolatry. He defiled Chopa in the valley of the sons of Hinnom to stop the worship of Molech. He destroyed the high places in Jerusalem that Solomon had built for his heathen wives. The shrine to the golden calf at Bethel was destroyed. He is then eventually slain in battle against the king or Pharaoh Necho in Megiddo. Megiddo is also where we sometimes get the phrase and terms that produce Armageddon, that same area. It's a location name, not a theological name. We still have Zephaniah, Nahum, Jeremiah, and Habakkuk prophesying. And Assyria was in the process of falling to what would rise after them. That's the Medo-Persian Empire. And so they're going to take the place of the Assyrians as the strong, powerful noose around the area. From Josiah, we get to Jehoahaz. Again, now thinking in terms of Judah. He is very wicked. He's a son of Josiah. He's made king by the people. And so here you have another one of those instances where king consistently seems to work towards good. The family, though, doesn't seem to follow in the same way. Zephaniah and Jeremiah are our prophets at this time. This leads us to Jehoiakim, or Jehoiachin. He's going to serve as king for 11 years. He's another son of Josiah, but he, unlike his brother, is made king by the Pharaoh. At this time frame, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon made Judah his vassal. Jehoiakim was loyal for 3 years, then rebelled. He had bands of Chaldeans, Arameans, Moabites, and Ammonites besieging and making havoc of the entire region. They took captives. They took possessions from the city. This is when Daniel is taken and brought to serve. And so this is where the story of Daniel begins, is around this time frame. He's chosen then to serve in the king's court in Babylon. And he'll be present there as his story begins and Israel's continues. Jehoiachin, as opposed to Jehoiakim, is a son of Jehoiakim, and then Nebuchadnezzar finally besieges Jerusalem. His officials surrendered and went out to the king, and he and 10,000 craftsmen of Judah were deported to Babylon. Ezekiel the prophet is also taken at this time. This is recognized amongst the Bible record and other aspects of history to be the descendancy line from which David's future heirs would come from. He eventually is released from prison and allowed a place of honor among the captives like him in Babylon. He was hanging out with basically all the trophies. That's a common context for that region, is to bring back indications of your victory. We tend to think of that in our modern parlance as that's what you like to call their gold and silver. What they did was capture up the kings. And says, no, I've subjugated those people. Well, how do we know you did that? His king's right there. Their king's right there, sitting next to the other king of the other nation, and the other king, and the other king. And so you have a living example of their power. Once that king would die, then they would also have all of the triumph stones put up that often are some of the strongest historical witnesses to these events. Jeremiah and Ezekiel are both active at this point. Ezekiel is the prophet to the common Jew in captivity. And so they have different perspectives as they are working and writing. Zedekiah, king of what's left of Judah, is another son of Josiah. He's a puppet king in place at Nebuchadnezzar's command, but he also rebels against Babylon. So Jerusalem is besieged again. It falls. The walls are battered into rubble. The city is burned. The temple was destroyed. All the remaining treasures are taken out. Every single person except for the incredibly poor is taken captive. His sons and the officials are killed before his eyes. Jeremiah's message is it's too late. There's nothing we can do. This is how it is. That brings us to Gedaliah, a 2-month king, if you want to call him that. He's not of the royal line, but he is the new puppet governor. This is where the leadership in this region shifted off of kings for a while, goes to governors. King come back again in the Roman Empire. But in this time frame, everything is being squished, if you will, from the oppressive powers. And as that happens, lots of folks that are still in the area that were not captive flee. And in the end, Judah now has fallen. Very short order. of time goes from the beginning of the fall of the northern kingdom to the conclusion of the fall of the southern kingdom. When we think about this time frame, we start kind of get details about it. Now, this is all approximate. Israel fell to the Assyrians in about 721 BC or BCE. Judah fell not long after to the Babylonians in 586 BC or BCE. These are not far removed events from each other in the sense of the way in which time flows. If you think about it in the larger perspective, we've got a time frame that goes from about 1042 BC to about 586 BC, which means under the kings, that's a 456-year dynasty. That's a long time by any metric if we're thinking about things. But in the big picture of things, that's not the metric we need to be watching. That's not the full picture of things. That just shows us a little bit of what's going on and what will go on. This is now the point where by plan and intention, we've got about 5 minutes or so of class time where we can ask some questions that we haven't been doing. So number one, from now we get to go from basically the beginning of man until the end of the kingdoms. What are some of the things that you've studied about from that whole spectrum that you really have enjoyed reminding yourself of? Like, this is the stuff I liked, thinking about Genesis to, in this case, Malachi, if you will. What's a good positive?
God always gave his people hope. If they would follow him, he would forgive them.
Yeah, from a theological standpoint, there is never a point where God completely is done with the people. Even as they go into captivity, they are promised rescue. They're promised that there will be return potential. Now, they don't hear it, like they don't feel it, and their countenance is down really low, and only a few people are on that walking journey into captivity that really have a mindset of they're going to come back, because their attitude about it is, we're never going to come back. This is, we're gone, we're done for. What else? I'll tell you what I like, come from this standpoint. I like that you get to see God interact with humanity across all of its various edges. God interacts with humanity at its very best. Even after the garden, he interacts with the very best of humanity's intentions. God interacts with us at our very worst as humanity. And in all of those interactions, you're seeing the same God. His behavior is consistently gracious and understanding. Now, a graceful and understanding God is also a God who is firm, strong, and has a moral expectation. Because grace really is the response to a moral standard. An absence of no standard, then there is no grace. They kind of have to go hand in hand. And he extends that grace routinely and regularly to individuals that you and I might look at and go, I'm not so sure about that. Here's another way to think about it. This is a challenge for all of us. If you were given the choice, are you going to re-elect David as king after his circumstances with Bathsheba? Now, wait a minute. Now you've gone from teaching to meddling, Mr. Preacher, because you're causing me to have to make a choice I may not like. I'm going to tell you, I'd have a hard time beginning to say yes to that, from my perspective, because he crossed a very strong line where that's a no-go line. You do not treat other humans that way, let alone those who are unable to protect themselves. So that's like a hard no for me on one level. So here we have an instance where I'm admittedly saying, God is going and being more gracious than I can conceive of doing. Now, to be fair, in my illustration thinking about this history, none of them were given a vote. They didn't get to choose. We do get to choose in our system of governance. as infinitesimally small as our choice may be, we still have the ability to put that little check mark there and go, yay or nay, right? Remember, not voting is probably worse than voting in some ways. Because then you're just saying, let everyone else sort it out. That's kind of abrogating your responsibility to a certain degree. You could always choose somebody else. And if you want to, you could always write in Shirley Cooper's name. I'll tell you, she's going to do better than most of 99% of the choices. Shirley's not happy with me right now.
No, the deal is, the thing that we need to remember about David is that he repented.
He did, but he repented when called to the carpet. Now that's the thing. He repented when Mama caught his hand in the cookie jar. When the prophet came and said, a whole long spiel, when he thought he had gotten away with it. I thought I was all right. No, you're the man. He had to be worked over to get there. He got the emotional pugil. Still, once again, Shirley Cooper should be voted in for every office above everybody else. 100%. I think that's a win-win for all parties involved. In fact, I probably would vote for everybody around here, including the shrubs, than most of the choices we have. Some of our shrubs are dead out there. They need some help. But I want you to think about that in the way that we see the world. Because one of the things that I love about studying this history is it challenges me to rethink the way I see the world. Because God works with us, and I might not be willing to work with the people that God chooses to work with. Because he also uses the Assyrians, the Medo-Persians, the Babylonians, and all of the surrounding nations of Israel as part of his context and full picture for all of humanity. And as challenging as it is, his goal is through Israel to serve all of them. Even the ones that make us worry about how wicked they were and how much more wicked we were. He's serving them too. So I love that part of it when we're thinking about this history. Is there stuff in all of this that you wish you knew more about? That's my constant question. Like, do you wish you had some more insight into this? And I got a long list from Genesis 6 and verse 2 backwards to the very beginnings of creations. There's stuff I don't know and I would like to be able to understand. But I also understand this. I don't get to. And as much as we sometimes joke about it, well, I'll ask that question when we get there. I want you to think about your pictures of what heaven is portrayed like in the New Testament. And do you ever find that portrayal like sitting up like a lecture class where someone's asking a bunch of questions? We want that to be the case. And I say we being me. I would love to be able to ask some questions. But it's never actually shown that way. It doesn't mean your questions aren't going to get answered, but it may mean they're not addressed in the ways that you're expecting, or it could mean something else because it simply does not spell it out for us. So our ignorance actually is something we're going to have to accept. By the way, that's what faith looks like, is accepting things, not knowing at the earthly level of knowing. That's it for our time this morning. We got to close out right there, so I appreciate everyone's participation today. Thanks.